Alka Sehgal-Cuthbert. Welcome to Thinking Class. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me, John.
It really is my pleasure. You've been on the hit list of people I've wanted to invite on the show since I decided to start a Thinking Class in October last year, and I began in November. And you were on my hit list because I'd learned of you in the lockdowns when I was doing lots of reading because, things were generally a bit quieter, and I was able to get a grasp of things that were becoming prominent in the public conversation, or specifically in our institutions, including corporate institutions of which I was working in, specifically around things like Black Lives Matter. And you were writing articles in The Spectator and other publications, which I found to be impressive and necessary at that moment in time to act as a counterbalance to these topics of anti-racism, which were being popularized by Ibram X. Kendi, Robin DiAngelo at the time. So it is a true pleasure to have you here, and I'm sure we'll get into all of those things. But perhaps we begin with the work that you do for your organization, Don't Divide Us. Perhaps you can tell us what it's about, who's dividing us and why are we divided?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me, John. It's a pleasure to be able to talk about these things, so thank you. Well, in terms of Don't Divide Us, as you said, we emerged spontaneously in response to the events of 2020. And the first response was the debate was so divisive and harsh and so intolerant and so sort of year zero type, you either think this way about race and racism or you're beyond the pale. And there didn't seem to be any space for a pluralism that I had always felt instinctively was very important in a democratic society. So the immediate response really was that, surely, despite everything, we have more in common than we have that divides us. So that, if you like, was the first core tenet, if you like, of Don't Divide Us, that our common humanity is more important than what divides us. Now, common humanity, we don't mean that everybody kind of sings Kumbaya together. Common humanity means that we recognize that as human beings, we have certain things that define us as human beings, and they remain the same, whatever your skin color, whatever part of the world you're born in, and really whether you live in Islington or whether you live in Hackney or whether you live in, a little country village. There are certain, as humans, we are morally equal. So that was our starting point. But I suppose I would say that as time has gone on, our ideas have developed a bit, and we've seen the importance of certain cultural topics, if you like, that are now very contested, that we feel are necessary to defend because they support our core tenet, which is that our common humanity is common to us all. And those are to do with the way we see history, our past, which I think affects, how we see the past and where we see ourselves fitting in the past and with our eye on the future as well. Kind of shapes how we see the world around us, how we see ourselves and how we see each other. And this kind of critical social justice ideology, of which critical race theory is one part of, is very intolerant of that. It really stigmatizes. It's premised on rejecting the past and seeing the past as an obstacle towards going forwards and towards creating a better society today. And I just don't think nothing in my whole experience and nothing in everything that I've studied academically indicates that. Everything points to the opposite, that we draw. The past may have good and bad things and may boring, mediocre things, but it is essentially a resource, a collective resource, which we need to draw on to make sense of our world today and to guide us in how we go forwards.
Frank Furedi, who you may have heard of, he recently just released a book called The War Against the Past, and in it he writes about year zero ideology, this idea of social engineers effectively making their way into institutions and finding a way of wiping the slate clean And then if the past is ever brought up at all, it's seen as malevolent, which I guess you've been talking about. He also talks about the difference between those who seek to denigrate it, dismiss it, and wipe it off the record, as that's clearly not the right way, and neither is it the right way to look at it only in a sunny side up. There's nothing to see here, nothing to criticize.
Mm-hmm.
But as you've talked about there, is this idea of trying to look at it in the round, being able to spot times where there might have actually been moral good coming out of something, even as something as seemingly contentious as the British Empire these days. It should not be a contentious thing to do, because there clearly would have been examples. And yet also finding the shortcomings. Both of those things both give you a bar to reach. If it's something that is a moral good, it's an attempt to govern virtuously, act virtually individually, or gives you something to avoid. Because as there are many historians who'll tell you, if history's cyclical, if things don't repeat but they rhyme, and there's certain things that humans do, then it's better to know what it is that we do and the pitfalls we fall into. Because if you wipe that slate clean, if you say that there's nothing to see here, it's just all bad, and let's just crack on, because we know the ideas that are going to propel us into this progressive sunlit upland, they're just going to fall in the same trap as everyone else that they've denigrated before them.
Yes, that's right. Yes, I mean, I'm reading Frank Brady's book at the moment, and it's very interesting because he points to a sort of a paradox where, on the one hand, history is something you want to kind of cut yourself off from because it was so bad, but at the same time, they're kind of like the people who advocate for this ideology are obsessed by it, but they're not obsessed by history in the round, as you say. What they're obsessed by is a selective choice that they think defines all subsequent events from that moment, from its instantiation, be it slavery, be it colonialism. And the problem, I mean, I'm from India, my family heritage, and the problem with that is that I find it's very patronizing, essentially, is that it really doesn't leave any space for the fact that whatever colonialism did in India, it introduced certain ideas, certain values, which Indian intellectuals at the time could engage with and make their own, and then contribute to the development of Indian society in a way that both owed something to what the Western culture had brought to them, but also drew on their own indigenous culture and knowledge. So, that the possibility of a genuine conversation between countries from different civilizations, Western and Indian, which both recognizes the necessary freedom of being different, but also as being equal, is really denied by this critical ideology, because it's saying that that moment was so bad, was so morally reprobate, that nothing positive can ever come out of it. And our duty, and really what they are obsessed with doing, really their starting point isn't the past at all, it's today. It's like they want to make a claim for British society today as being institutionally racist. And when they can't really justify that empirically or through a logical argument, their intellectual recourse is to pick on this one thing in the past and amplify and amplify and amplify until it becomes the whole picture. And then it becomes really kind of a negative thing in every way, intellectually, morally, politically.
A self-destructive course to take. We have seen within your organisation that you are, I suppose, trying to show another way in which to live amongst one another in a multi-ethnic society. And within the principles of Don't Divide Us, I noticed the word anti-racist being used, and we've touched on it. I suppose for those people who see the word employed, and those concerned about critical race theory, it does bring to mind the likes of Ibram X. Kendi, Robin DiAngelo, this idea of the only way to solve past discrimination is current discrimination and flip things around. What way is "Don't Divide Us"'s use of it different to those who are critical race theorists?
Well, I mean, this has occupied a lot of my time. I'm still not sure I've got a definitive answer. It's something I'm still working through, really. But in 2020, I wrote a pamphlet for the Academy of Ideas called "The Dangers of the New Anti-Racism," which is based on a speech I did for them. And in that, I made the point that anti-racism, as it developed in the 20th century, was really, you could say, it came under an umbrella of a universal humanistic outlook. And the point of anti-racism then was to, having identified that there were disadvantages that applied to people as groups, that it was in the benefit of everyone, not just like giving a charitable helping hand, but literally freedom and equality for everyone would be enhanced if those disadvantages were overcome. And that was the basis for a solidarity that could cut across ethnic lines. And in striving for that improvement, that moral and political and social improvement, society for everyone was made better. So the idea was not to sort of take away from Peter to give to Paul. The idea was to raise everybody up and to create greater freedom for everybody. But I think that is very, very different. The kind of overall cultural and moral umbrella today is not universal or humanistic. I don't know what you would call it, but it isn't that. And now it's become much more a kind of sort of very vicious, strident redistribution, and if X has this, or if X is in that position, then Y cannot possibly do anything other than to just, get rid of X and take over, kind of thing. That's what they mean when they say white allies should do the work and make space for Black voices. I mean, personally, I just would find that, the thought that I might have got my place at Cambridge to do my PhD because I was a brown woman is just appalling. I can't imagine anything more degrading than encouraging that kind of thinking rather than a more traditional meritocratic standard that you apply to yourself and to others.
You're not the first person to say that who is brown skinned that I've spoken to in life. There are former colleagues where I have seen these informal leadership programs be set up inside of an organization, and instead of them being put out for application, people have been chosen based on whether they're going to tick the diversity box. And I remember being on a call with a couple of people. Both were of ethnicity from the subcontinent, but though both had actually come out of Africa, one south, one east. And one was actually a freeman of the City of London, and the other had been through the red brick universities. Now, I'm not playing any of these victim games here to say I had it worse, but I was an early school leaver, no university education until late in my 20s, open university stuff whilst working, and from Northumberland, and I was excluded from the process on the basis of my ethnicity. And I said, surely we don't really want to do this and we just want to open it up to application for everyone. And the person who was leading it said, yeah, I think that too, but the bosses just say we need diversity. I got off the call and I had a call straight away from them. And they both said, I really don't like the idea that I'm being given a shot because of the color of my skin. And so this seems to be common. I mean, I think there's so many people who've written about it in the States as well, the Glenn Rowleys and John McWhorters of this world who would resent the idea that they got anywhere in their big academic lives through being Black. They did it because they worked hard.
I think that's right. And I think, Don't Divide Us, getting increasing number of emails from people, who are not intellectuals. They don't work in academia and they haven't necessarily had, been to university either. By the way, I smiled earlier because I went to my first polytechnic was in Newcastle, and I think Northumbria is lovely. But what's happening is that this it's not just like a misguided thing that is just something you can say, oh, that's stupid, and ignore, because it's actually ruining relationships. It's actually actively corroding. People who have worked alongside each other for decades are now being told, where these schemes are being introduced, that their very existence poses a threat to someone that they've regarded as a friend and a colleague all their life. So, and it's like we're being encouraged to constantly interpret our experiences through racial lenses. So I'm meant to be continually on the lookout for slights and microaggressions, and you are meant to be continually on the lookout for, giving offence and, being active in the microaggressive relationship. So that, in that situation, how can you have a good faith conversation? How can you, you can't really you can't trust others when you're continually not trusting yourself, kind of thing. So it's very, I think, psychologically quite a damaging outlook to be, endorsing as a normal and, an admirable, desirable way of thinking, when it clearly isn't, for anybody, other than the people doing the training, of course, who are making a lot of money out of it.
Indeed. I can't help but think about how the governing philosophies of those who run our institutions have changed over time. So we've talked a lot about freedom, compassion, equality today, and that they're the things that guide, don't divide us. And in my mind, it strikes me as, well, these are the qualities, the values that over time have been created, at least socially, by institutional Christianity in the West for a long time. And that was what guided everyone, even if you were a dissenter, even if you weren't particularly a believer. That was what guided our political class for a long time. It's how our institutions were set up. And that was the core message upon which the whole of society was ultimately taught. And then we saw post-World Wars, lots of faith in those institutions collapse, and then these various different ideological revolutions from the 60s, of which we've been talking about some offshoots from, with critical race theory, critical theory in general, which starts to view things in a very different way. And I wonder whether this new governing philosophy of looking at things in the power relations and also dividing people up in a different way to the class-based view that typical Marxians would have looked at it, and now looking at it through ethnic lenses, are now just putting fuel on the fire of something which Christianity, through St. Paul, we are neither Gentile nor Jew, which had ended up in the mindset, is now being expunged from the record from this war on the past. And now we have people who are ultimately bringing us back to this birds of a feather flock together mindset, making it obvious what's different about us all, beginning ethnically, but now obviously there are religious elements to this now too. And I suppose this is an open question. I don't necessarily expect you to have the answer, but the future without the Christian governing ideals, I don't know how long the things like freedom, compassion, equality can remain on the table as something that exists within the culture. The further it gets divorced from that, and the more we keep on juicing our institutions with this other idea of power and victimhood. I don't know what you think about that, Alka.
No, I certainly recognise, what you're describing, and I would agree with the trajectory that you've outlined. It's, and I think religion broadly does have something to do with it, because religion's is the largest, if you like, receptacle for belief, and a society that negates belief is going to be a very dry, shallow, not a very pleasant place to be in, because as humans, one of the things we do is believe. We think, we believe, and we imagine. Those are kind of fundamental things to being human. On the institutional things, everything I've looked at, I think the one thing I would say is that the collapse didn't happen immediately after the Second World War. I think, if you like, that social democratic period that was materially founded on the establishment of the welfare state was, Marshall, one of the, if you like, the authors of the thinkers of the welfare state, recognized at the time that it would be a compromise. It would be a temporary compromise, but it was a necessary compromise. And it wasn't just a case of providing organizations that could dish out rights or dish out medical services or educational services. It was on such a scale that it did reorganize society. It was provided a framework in which people understood their work lives and built up their work relationships. And it included the Commonwealth, which is how my parents came over to Britain in the early 60s. And so we were a generation of immigrants that had some, if you like, not historical knowledge of British culture in some way through having been colonized by Britain. And whatever my mum and dad, generations like my mum and dad thought of Britain politically, they really admired British culture. They admired the high culture, particularly my dad, who was educated. My mum was less educated, but, they admired the high culture, Shakespeare and the Romantic poets, but they also admired the possibility, the way of life that British culture offered, the autonomy and respect for the family, but the autonomy of the family, the idea of an Englishman's home is his castle, the idea that my dad, who in the 70s stood for the local Labour Party, he was amazed. He was saying, in India, this could never happen. I would have to have a sort of bucket full of rupees to be able to bribe my way to be, get anywhere near being a political candidate. So, those kinds of, if you like, less tangible aspects of British life and culture, I think, did provide a commonality, right? They provided a basis for a commonality through which our differences, are important. They are what make us unique as well, but they're not the only things. If we set our limits at what makes us different, we're cutting off a huge part of our own selves, really. And that common culture allows, I think, and facilitates the kind of tolerant attitude of a way of life that that most people of a certain generation associate and admire and love Britain for. And that is going not just through a Marxist march through the institutions, but it's going really because I think, and extrapolating from my research that looked at education and educational policy from the post-war period to, say, the early 2000s, was that they were unable, the ruling classes, if you like, and that includes both parties, not just Labour or Conservative, increasingly felt unable to deliver on that promise, and they began to retreat from it themselves. So you can see, institutionally, there was an actual structural breakup of the whole administrative state under Thatcher in the 80s. Right, that introduced the commercialization element into education that we now see amplified on, turbocharged on testosterone, if you like, in the kind of marketization of, teaching kids about gender, sex, and race. It's not anything that is done by a teacher that is there representing an intellectual and moral leadership. It's being done by paying new so-called experts in race, whatever that may mean, to come in and tell people how rubbish they are if they're white and how victimized they are if they're brown. I mean, this has been, the doors to this have been opened by the institutional and moral retreat of our political class from a project that once was more humane, once was able to provide a common culture. It can't do that at the current moment. I don't have an answer. You're right. I don't, but I think we need a new politics. There's got to be a political realignment at some point. That you can't just, do a Blue Peter and say, here's what I made earlier. It's kind of going to be a bit more painful than that, I think.
Tracy Island's papier-mâché model pulled out.
Yeah, I remember that one.
Yeah, an old classic. And for those listening who are either not old enough or not British, you're not going to get it. I'd Google that. You talked a bit about the political class and and how there might need to be a realignment of politics at some point. I know also you have written a paper recently where you made the argument that public policy has played a role in fostering the preconditions for the violent disorder that we've seen in Britain, which has been referred to as the riots, for example. Could you describe what role public policy has played over the years in creating that, and what public policies in particular have done that?
Well, I think I'll stick with the example of education because that's the one I know most about. But we can really see, and in that paper, I trace it back to really the Education Act of 1986 that came on the back of a report called the Swan Report. At the risk of being a bit geeky, I'll just very briefly say it's a fascinating history of that report because it saw life in the late 70s under Shirley Williams, the Labour Secretary of State for Education then. And it started off life as a inquiry into the educational underachievement of Afro-Caribbean boys. Now, shortly after that, there was a change of government. The Conservatives came in. They decided to continue with that report, but they changed the leadership of it. And then in the intervening time, in the intervening few years, you'd had the riots, the inner city riots in London, Birmingham, and Bristol. And then what you saw in the sort of the remaining kind of 2 to 3 years till 1985, when the report was published, was the Conservatives adopted really wholesale all the multicultural educational ideas that Labour had been, if you like, trialing in little pockets, mainly in the GLC. So they had been experimenting with that on a small scale. So there were things like, you know, their attempt to address educational underachievement amongst Afro-Caribbean boys involved telling teachers that they should, you know, value the Creole language and let pupils write in their Creole, and that, you know, standard English didn't matter so much, and not, you know, it was important, but not that important. More important was the self-esteem. And if self-esteem could be cheaply bought by saying, yeah, your Creole is great, carry on with that, that was the way forward. And there were objectors to that. You know, there were people who objected to that, but their voices were not heard. You know, they were not listened to, really. You know, there was one Caribbean writer, something like Maureen Stone, made some very, very trenchant criticisms of that policy, but was ignored. And so it was the Conservatives that actually brought that through the Education Act, which was presented in terms of parent choice and presented in terms of probably legitimately trying to sort of rein in the excesses of a kind of child-centered education policy. Mm. But nonetheless, also opened the door to, you know, multiculturalism is the way to go. And that meant a teacher not going into a classroom and addressing the children as a whole. You know, we're all in this together. We're going to learn knowledge that is going to be unfamiliar to all of you because it's disciplinary, based on disciplinary knowledge. And we're going to work hard at it together. And in that shared endeavor, you do form common bonds. You form bonds of commonality, even though you have the differences as well. And instead of that, you have teachers going and saying, oh, well, you know, we're going to be reading this book, but, oh, you over there, if this is, you know, not relevant to you, if you're having problems accessing it, then let's find you something different, you know. And you have the kind of, this also took the form of personalization of the curriculum. And at one point in 2009, I think it was, Cambridge Assessment did a review of their assessments. It was in English literature, it was possible for virtually every pupil to have their own individual pathway to the exam, which meant there was literally, in terms of literature, no common culture there. It was all, you become treated as an individual consumer. Or as a sort of passive recipient of you needing validation from people outside of you, rather than trying to tackle knowledge that has passed the test of time. Going back to history, yeah, sure, some things may become a bit redundant, and the curriculum isn't set in stone. But if you believe in truth and objectivity, then there is knowledge that is there from which the curriculum should be constructed. And all children, whatever their linguistic capacity, need to have access to that so that they can then extend that as they go forward as adults. They will have had an experience of working in common. At the minute, as soon as children go to school, they are being addressed as different. What their importance, their significance, their social significance, what is worthwhile about them is how different they are, rather than what they do out of their own will, if you like, in the company of other children in the same place. So in that way, I think the institutional culture and their practices of education are really fueling the problem. I'd say it's a major source of the problem, actually, academia and schools today.
When you were talking there, it reminded me of something that I read about through Roger Scruton when I learned of who Roger Scruton was in my late 20s and started to read a lot of his work. And he used to have a magazine called the Salisbury Review in the early 1980s. And a teacher from Bradford called Ray Honeyford wrote an article for it. And as you were talking, it seems to me as though we're in a similar place 40 years on. And whilst we're talking openly about it, it was very dangerous for people to question this new change in education because it cost Ray Honeyford his job for doing so. And I just pulled up a few snippets of his article here, which pretty much gets to the core of what you're saying. And this was back in 1982, I think, or maybe even 1984. So he said, those of us working in Asian areas are encouraged officially to celebrate linguistic diversity, i.e. applaud the rapidly mounting linguistic confusion in those growing number of inner city schools in which British-born Asian children begin their mastery of English by being taught in Urdu. And then he countered that if a school contains a disproportionate number of children for whom English is a second language, true of all Asian children, even those born here, or children from homes where educational ambition and the values to support it are conspicuously absent, i.e. the vast majority of West Indian homes, a disproportionate number of which are fatherless, then academic standards are bound to suffer. So he pretty much put his foot on all of the landmines you possibly could in a newly multicultural Britain, where he talked about some of the cultural black spots, I suppose, within certain communities, why that might not particularly support a good educational outcomes, and then also questioned whether it was a particularly good idea to be celebrating linguistic diversity when his job as a teacher is to try to get everyone towards a common curriculum. And obviously, if you're teaching a subject within Britain, you would expect that it's okay to lead in English. And I think he died 12 years ago, according to this Wikipedia page, and he was persona non grata still at that point. He was never exonerated. Now, maybe there were some other things he wrote that were particularly exceptional, but Roger Scruton seems to maintain, or at least maintained up until his death, that ultimately it was that growing sign of cancel culture, and it was ruthless, and indeed it cost Roger Scruton much in his own academic career, and he had to go off and do his own thing. So it sounds to me like nothing's really changed, but things have become much more entrenched in the 40 years now, hence.
Yes, definitely. I mean, but I think, there's a point when the kind of changes reach a tipping point, and something, they become qualitatively quite different. And going just sort of looping back to first of all, I agree with what you've said totally. And it's interesting, when I was writing the paper that I recently put up on our website, I found out that Frank Field and Enoch Powell had been friends, right? Which was very interesting, because that Frank Field said, that when Enoch Powell made that Rivers of Blood speech, what it did was make it impossible for anyone to speak about immigration. It was a complete topic, as well as him becoming persona non grata, unlike the twits today who think that he had great influence. He actually didn't. He was sacked the next day, and it was the end of his career. But he had been a friend of Frank Field, and that it shows you that there's And it's quite interesting. I am beginning to kind of, revisit and rethink this whole question of official anti-racism, because I think it might be helpful to make a distinction between a multi-ethnic society that I think Britain has been for quite a while, and the fact on the ordinary everyday level, immigrants have been coming to Britain at different times in different places, including in the north, in Sheffield and, places like that. And actually on ordinary working class communities, they're pretty much just got on and integrated, right? There have been periodic episodes of racist violence, but that's coexisted with coexistence and intermarriage, and people would come and, the Lascars would come, and they would, there's a great book by David Holland actually about this, very meticulously researched. And, they would come and they would, take board, they would lodge with white working class families, and often ended up like marrying the daughters or the neighbours' daughters or something, and having kids. So that was going on. So I think the official anti-racism that really happened after the Nationality Act, when Britain was giving up its colonies, the Commonwealth was being established, and the Nationality Act kind of allowed former Commonwealth people to come to Britain as British subjects. But then very soon after, there's a kind of concern amongst our elites about the relationships within Britain domestically, not the colonial relationships over there, but within Britain, as more Commonwealth people came over. And looking at that first Race Relations Act in 1965, I'm not so sure that I've always accepted it as a good thing. That it was a good thing to have an act that made discrimination illegal, which of course it is. But it was like limited. It's like that act was also. It wasn't just about that. You read it, and if you read the discussion in Hansard, really, the motivating factor, I would say, was actually fear of public disorder. It was actually fear of a reaction amongst white working class people, as it happens. And it was introduced by the Labour Party. The Conservative criticism of that act at the time was to, it said, in employment, sure, you can have a level of legislation, but a lot of these problems that were being talked about might be better settled informally or through civic conciliatory procedures. And that the risk for this act was that it would criminalize a whole swathe of people for things that really did not deserve criminalizing, clumsy speech, awkward communication, etc. And as you say, like that was in 1965, and you can see that happening with the kind of, all the hate speech legislation today, that kind of the tight regulation of people's relationships is really writ large. And I think it was kind of like embryonic then, but at that time you still had an organized working class, you still had a broadly humanistic culture. So the authoritarian tendencies were kept in bay, but they don't exist anymore. And I think now we're seeing the authoritarianism, what was incipient then, now becoming amplified a million times in a very disturbing way, I think. Sorry, I don't even know what your original question was. I've lost
it definitely your response was certainly linked to the question. So don't worry about that. I see in the corporate world lots of organizations that push the multicultural model, insofar as you have lots of separate multicultural network groups, and it might be the Black network, it might be the Muslim network, and I don't believe they contribute to a sense of cohesion in the workplace. And I wonder whether it is actually these organizations that they're a microcosm for the balkanization that we've started to see everywhere else. And because these organizations typically tend to be influential in forming, our de facto governing elites, whether people consider themselves to be governing elites or not. But if you're in these large organizations which are critical to various services, public and private, in the country, and then you have all of this social, ideologically driven things there, whether people think they're ideologically driven or not. They are. Multiculturalism is a specific worldview of which is built on various ideological strands. And your mission at Don't Divide Us is to make sure people aren't stoking division. So I suppose my question to you, Alka, is how can private and public sector leaders prevent their organisations inadvertently stoking division or worsening the state of race relations in the UK?
Well, now definitely, they certainly are, if you like, an expression of the wider balkanisation, the sectarianism that we see in society, where we no longer have a general public. We are addressed as different communities. So I get sick of hearing the word communities. It's like, oh, the Indian community. What Indian community? I'm here. I live in Norwich. I have my friends. I do my work. What is this fictitious Indian community that I'm meant to be part of? I have a personal history to India and a connection with India, yes, but that doesn't make a community. So they are creating these kind of fictitious, fetishized version of sectarian expression of that. But they're also, I think, in management, whether it's a public sector employer or a private employer, they're also an outcome of stasis and real kind of poor management arising from not a technical lack of knowledge, but an inability or an unwillingness to actually act in an authoritative way. And I noticed this first as a teacher, when it's like, rather than sort of exerting authority and saying, no, this behavior is wrong and kids will go into detention if they do this, it was like you just let it slide and slide and slide until you get to the point where you'd rather call in the police to deal with it. Rather than having, should have dealt with it properly, like 2 months ago, we wouldn't have got to this position where you need the police in a school. I mean, it seemed terrible to me that you need the police to come into a school to discipline people who are essentially children. What kind of a message is that sending? So, when I think that is writ large in workplaces. You see this sort of management is unwilling to sort of act in a clear, authoritative, confident way for fear of being seen oppressive, for fear of being seen as racist or transphobic or misogynistic. And that kind of creates a sense of paralysis. And when you have that, things go wrong, people get frustrated, tensions arise, mistakes are made. I'm sure a lot of the horrible things we hear about things that happen in hospitals, I'm not denying the possibility of intentional malevolence, but quite often they're a result of complete institutional breakdown in procedures internally, and no one really taking responsibility because no one's quite sure who is responsible for that part of the work, and the tendency to always outsource. And I think in that context, the establishment of these sort of ethnic groups, communities and networks is a way of managing that. It's a way of kind of managing that in a way that isn't really managing it properly, but it's appearing to manage it. And it is a way also of them managing the relationships, the discontent that arises in a very authoritarian way. I've yet to see anything positive emerge from any of these BAME networks. And what they seem to be doing is trying to kind of cultivate a new kind of little black elites in workplaces, that they're not really elites because it's nothing they've done for themselves. They've all been, it's all been created and set up for them and managed by wider elites who are all sorts of colours, but they're not being done for the benefit of black people, even though it seems like that. And I'm not saying some black people don't benefit, but they're very few. It's mainly the middle-class black people that benefit. The people who are at the bottom, whatever their colour, remain at the bottom, So it's these professional BAME networks. They're really horrible. I really hate it, especially in education. I see loads of them, come, if you're a black teacher, come and join this black leadership group. And it's really disgusting. You should be thinking of yourself as a teacher. And if you're going to belong to any community, it will be as an English teacher, because that's what I taught, or a history teacher, or a maths teacher. And that way you learn things that will be helpful to you in your job, for which you have public consent and public money, instead of which we're being encouraged to associate on purely arbitrary grounds for which nobody is given wider consent, and which is coming out of the taxpayer's purse. I mean, I'm surprised. I'm amazed that there isn't more upset and unrest amongst British public at this going on, to be honest. I think we're very tolerant still. Ordinary people are.
Yes, I think there's probably corners of the internet that might also say that the recent turning of the screw on expression of distaste about these particular institutional biases that are being set up, and the consequences of expressing those expressions of distaste mean that people probably feel like they can't. I think Eric Kaufman makes the point is that the race taboo governs most Western societies, and so people feel very afraid to say anything because it's so elastic, and things can be pushed into a box and say that thing that you're saying, that question, that expression of dissent, is by in itself racist, and because it's a career-ending thing, because it's a livelihood-ending thing, I think people find it very hard to bring it up. As you were talking there, and you're talking about the various programs that are set up to bring specific ethnic minorities up through an organization, so affirmative action programs, I've had similar thoughts about these, where you talked about the ethnic minorities who benefit tends to be already middle class. They might have already, taken that further. They might have been through red brick universities, the graduate programs, all of those things. And I'm from Northumberland. Now I'm from a middle class background myself, son of a construction worker, but, in management. And I went to school with lots of people in the trades, people who were farmers, agricultural workers, or, in retail jobs. And parts of that county are not doing that well. You've got ex-mining towns which are on their knees ultimately. And I've heard Dr. Rakib Ehsan, social cohesion researcher, Royal Holloway University, I think he's now at Buckingham University with Eric Kaufman, he often makes the point that places like Blackpool, which are impoverished, not a lot of diversity there. So actually, if you want to be trying to raise the boats for people, if you want to be really helping people, you want to be trying to find those diamonds in the rough, I suppose, in these places that are left behind and long forgotten, irrespective of ethnic identity. Because if you care about the raising of the boats, then you need to cast your net wider. Whereas if you come up with, and I'm using a term that I've heard in the corporate circles, if you come up with a black action plan, and you're based in London, and you've got 13% of your population are black, and you're bringing them in, but there is actually a benefit to being born in London already, insofar as you are on the doorstep of some of the world's biggest companies, all of the jobs effectively that you might want to do and that are heavily remunerated. And so actually, if you're going to level the boats, look beyond that, look beyond the metropolitan center, and forget about the ethnicity, and try and just provide the opportunities for everyone. I think it's going to be very hard to see those things get wound down, even if people start to agree with that line of argument, and people are free not to, because the optics are so bad in doing so. And so I don't know whether we'll see, an emerging trend of these things getting rolled back, or maybe they'll be presented as it's done what we said it is going to do, really good stuff. Now we're moving on to the next thing. I know we don't have too much longer left, Alka, and we talked a lot about being in the age of identity politics, and we talked a lot about how multiculturalism and this idea of dividing people up into communities is leading to less understanding between people within Britain. And I've seen the emergence of the Anglo identity amongst Zoomers, so Gen Z, they feel dispossessed due to mass immigration and multiculturalism. And I suppose my question to you as someone who, you're the ultimate synthesis, right? You're someone of Indian ethnicity who's come, married into the tribe, as it were. You've got what seems to be an Anglo-Saxon hyphenated surname with your Indian name there, which is very similar to my wife to be. She's half Indian, and I wonder whether this emergence of Anglo identity, based on everything we've seen, whether it's the institutional setup, whether it's the multiculturalist policies, is understandable. And what are the potential consequences from this rising Anglo identity?
Yeah, okay. Well, first of all, congratulations on your forthcoming marriage if you're engaged. Yeah. I think, no, of course you can, when you have a situation where our social fabric is already communalized, if you like, or sectarianized, stitched up into pockets, and then you have this a culture that is racialized, then reactions of people within that are going to take a racialized form as well. Hence the white, ethnic, national, but this isn't, I don't think it's it's understandable, but it's not a helpful or a progressive way. It doesn't offer I think, in my opinion, it's not a way forward to, if you like, nail your flag to that, pursuing that line of thinking, because it's really reinforcing the racialized thinking that's causing the problem in the first place. And, this is not actually that way of thinking. It is being endorsed, and it originates from our elites, right? It's not a bottom-up way of thinking. Ordinary people have always been, they've had to, because of their position, if you like, because class isn't a characteristic like anything else. Class is a very basic, very fundamental structuring of society. And now we've got a Labour Party that is, sort of talking about bringing class or socioeconomics into a protected characteristic type thing through a new Race Equality Act, which I think will be disastrous. It's like pouring petrol onto a bonfire that's just about kind of calming down now. And then, if they go ahead with that, it'll be a disaster. So I don't think that is it's understandable, but it is not the way forward. I don't think this would just die out of its own accord or run out of steam, unfortunately. Because while you have the majority of the people, as you said, feeling fearful, that will continue. But the hope is, because there are people, not just Don't Divide Us, there are many people, you've mentioned some of them, yourself, and not just in Britain, but internationally, who are beginning to, who are thinking basically, sod it, whatever the costs, I need to speak out. And that's a really good thing. In and of itself, speaking out won't do the job, but it's a very important prerequisite, because eventually, it will have to be challenged politically. There will have to be a coherent voice, because politics is the only sphere where these things can be decided democratically. If we want to be a democratic country, and I do, and I think most people do, not the advocates of critical social justice. I don't think they care about democracy. That is why they're very happy to base everything on the experiences of London or Birmingham, totally ignoring the fact of so many people who don't live in those cities. Those metropolitan little centres are being taken as the norm to which everybody should aspire to. Well, how's that going to work in a little Welsh village or a little village in Northumbria? That's just, it's a terrible, terrible, terrible anti-democratic way of approaching things. So I'm kind of cautiously optimistic. I think there's, on a good day, I'm cautiously optimistic. On a bad day, I think, oh my God, this is just so awful. I can't bear it. Everybody just go away. Leave me alone to my garden. But, there is no other way. If we don't want society to carry on being fragmented, fractious, authoritarian, if we don't want to lose our liberties that have been historically gained from, the Reformation onwards, if not before, then, there's no one else going to do it. It's you and me and everyone else that's that feels like that and wants to, will have to put time and effort into thinking about things, and a bit of courage to speak out, because if you forget, we are the majority. They are the minority, and just because they have very loud voices that take up all the space in an echo chamber, it doesn't mean they don't speak for everyone. So
yeah, well, I certainly second the notion of practicing expressing what it is you think and interacting with others. And that's partly why, in fact, the main reason I set up this podcast, I think, having sat around feeling the rather repressive speech codes, informal at the time, and worrying, I suppose, about the consequences. I was then, even though I knew that was not the right way of going, I was then inspired by hearing John Gray, I think, on another one from the Northeast, great political philosopher. He was on Andrew Sullivan's Dishcast podcast, and he spoke about how, whilst liberalism may well be over, the only way things ever stay alive is through the practicing it. They're not these abstract theoretical ideas. If you value something, you ought to practice. If the space doesn't exist for freedom of expression, create one. And that's what I've been trying to do with Thinking Class, in a way, to try to develop a courage within me to be able to try to express what it is that I'm thinking and hear what the other person has to say back to that, without worrying about whether I might get cut down at the feet at the same time. We're right into the end zone now, Alka, and what I'd like to do is ask you the question I ask all of my guests, which is, what have you changed your mind on during the course of your life, and what was it that made you think differently?
I think that's it's two things related: democracy and patriotism. I think, and yes, because when my political formation as a youngster, many decades ago, was left wing and anti-imperialist, and I don't think at that time I was fully distinguished between anti-imperialism and anti-patriotism. I think that the distinction, I felt it, but it was never it was never explicit. It was never very important. But then when I was doing my studying for my PhD, and I was looking at the British education policy, I could literally see, as I was reading these documents, how the public voice was more and more squeezed out as more and more of the policy became outsourced to, well, the EU. In that case, it was, transnational bodies, including the EU. And then Brexit came, and that was why I thought the Brexit referendum was so important. And then I did the thing that no academic should do if they want to last in academia, which luckily I didn't. I stood for the Brexit Party, and going out talking to people really, really brought home in a very visceral way how important democracy was, how much common sense most people have, spontaneous, not academic, but just common sense. You intuitively get to ideas and values and attitudes that you believe in yourself, but I would articulate them in a sort of prissy, often long-winded academese, which I'm trying to train myself out of. And people speak directly, and quite often it's there is such a thing as sense in common sense, the sense that common people have, and that is really, really important. It's really important that isn't stigmatized. It's really important that gets a hearing, and I think all of us in our different ways are trying to ensure that happens. So all more power to us.
Well, you stole my line. I was about to say more power to you, Alka. And in an age where democracy is certainly being squeezed by people who don't necessarily want to let the concerns of many be acted upon and governed in that spirit, and also in an age where people take any vote against what is the preferred route by those who typically hold the levers of power as being the product of them being misinformed. There's been a misinformation campaign. They couldn't have possibly thought of this themselves.
Yeah, like we're all so thick, you know. It's just,
yeah. Yes.
It's unbelievable, really unbelievable. And just quickly to say, you know, the patriotism is really linked to that because, you know, a love of country is if you don't love your country, then how can you possibly love any, you know, the common sense thing is if you don't love yourself, how can you love anyone else? But that scales up to the national level, you know, it's the largest unit of democratic accountability. If you keep trashing it all the time or ignoring it and thinking that consent lies with some broader international community, then you're ignoring the very people that you're meant to be, that you want their consent for you to rule, but you're ignoring their opinions and interests all the time. So that isn't going to work, is it?
Yeah, your point there about having patriotic mindset, it brings to mind a couple of things. Firstly, a former guest, Lionel Shriver, writes for The Spectator, amongst other things. She made the point that she grew up very anti-patriotic, and now in this age, she almost sees that it's a bit too dangerous to be anti-patriotic now, given that is the modus operandi of most people. Because, and I suppose to channel Yuval Noah Harari, who I'm not a huge fan of, and actually he stands for things that I don't necessarily stand for, but he makes the point that nationalism doesn't have to be a dirty word. In fact, nationalism expands the realm of empathy that you feel for people that don't live in the same town as you, that might not even look the same as you. And so this idea of trying to unite under the flag, and I get this image of Queen Elizabeth II's funeral, and I remember a particularly touching moment was when the Scottish and the Irish pipers were out and they were walking down the Mall, I think it was, and they were all under the flag. And then you had the English, the Guards, and you had all of these different people from these British Isles marching under one flag, and how long it took to even establish that peace and prosperity. And this takes us all the way back to the start, really, Alka, this idea of why you need to repudiate any of this year zero stuff. Because without knowing our histories, our quarrels, the way that we came together, and what it is that we share, which is this plot of land, this island, we're not going to get anywhere. If you trash the country, if you trash the flag, if you trash any notion of nationhood, then you are getting the balkanization. You're getting warring tribes. So let's keep fighting against it somehow.
Yes, definitely.
Well,
Cheers to that. You agree?
Cheers to that, Alka. And it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining, and hopefully we can speak again in the future.
Yes, too. Would love to. Take care.
Take care. Thank you. To keep up to date with all that I am doing, please subscribe to the Thinking Class YouTube channel @ThinkingClass and follow me on X @ThinkingClasses. Thinking Class seeks to understand the civilizational issues we face and why what our leaders do in response matters. Here, I seek to explore the ideas, values, and culture that made our civilization, those that are unmaking it, and how leaders at our public and private institutions should respond. Engage with me on YouTube or X, or write to me at thinkingclasspod@gmail.com to tell me who you want me to speak to and what topics are important to you. I look forward to seeing you there and for joining me on this journey.